Welcome to today's Energy Central Power session entitled Navigating Utilities Data-Rich Environment in the New Energy Landscape. Before we begin, I certainly want to thank the sponsor of today's event, CGI, for making it possible. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to our moderator of today's event, Mike Smith, to kick things off. Mike, welcome to the event. You have the floor.
Very good. Thank you, PJ, and welcome everybody to today's session. We're very fortunate to have a really compelling group of panelists who have some really deep and diverse experience in this space. So we're going to be hearing from them. I'm also going to encourage you all to please chime in with questions in the chat. We will do our best to incorporate those into our discussion. You can see here from our agenda that we're going to have some opening remarks. I'm going to introduce the panelists because they have some really impressive backgrounds we want you to know about. And we'll be diving into those three primary areas around that data to analytics journey, and then looking more specifically at the customer and operational use cases. So that's kind of how we'll be walking through this. And to get started, I would like to introduce today's panelists. So next slide, please. Actually, I'm going to make some opening remarks first. I want to spend just a couple of minutes kind of framing some of the big issues that we'll be talking about today. And a lot of what we'll be talking about, of course, is very much around data, how you manage that, how you get business value from that. But kind of the background noise with this is this energy transition that we're in. And in fact, you can see on this slide here with some data from the Energy Information Administration, there's some really interesting things going on in terms of the fuel mix. And I'm sure everyone's generally aware of this, but you can see where it was as of 2020 and what they're projecting to look at going out to 2050. And you can see they're projecting an overall renewables portfolio going from 21% to 42% over those 30 years. And of course, that has a lot of implications around how the customer is engaged, how the utility manages the grid, all those sorts of things. So we'll be exploring some of that today. Next slide, please. So what does all this mean? And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Obviously, it's a big market, but it's not just that it's a big market with billions of dollars being spent and the growth happening, but there's some very specific things that add business value to what utilities are doing, particularly as utilities go deeper into this energy transition. We're going to hear things today about AI and machine learning. We're going to hear about how these things are supporting some of the things we see here around renewable energy integration, some of the things on the customer side. What is data-driven decision-making? What are some examples of what that looks like? And some of the things that are really interesting where you're starting to talk about things like demand response, which may be a customer program, but it's impacting how the grid is managed. So we'll be getting into some of these things. Next slide, please. And again, so a little bit more of why this matters. I think as an industry, our industry is often driven a lot by technology, but there always has to be that foundational business driver behind it. And I think what's exciting about what we're going to be talking about today is there's very real tangible things that are happening that have a very real business impact. And you can see this is just a couple of examples that we pulled from some publicly available information. But when you think about things like asset management, and most utilities have some established processes where they conduct that asset management, a lot of it has been automated. But one of the interesting things is there's a lot of data within the asset management realm, as well as with those assets that they're managing, that create a lot of opportunities for different ways to create savings, improve processes, improve reliability, and even improve customer satisfaction from the asset management perspective as well. On the demand forecasting side, I think there's some really interesting things happening here that we're going to get into, because as the energy resources become more and more distributed, how you forecast for that is changing radically, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Next slide, please. And again, why does this matter? And this is just an example of a company called Utility 2030 Collaborative. They did some research last year where we looked at using behavioral change and customer behavior specifically, and how that's impacting what utilities are doing. You can see here that roughly 2/3 of the utilities, they are using predictive analytics to influence customer behavior. We'll talk about this as well, because this is where you get into, hey, we have a customer program, it may or may not be getting traction. What can we do to improve that? And this is where you get into customer tendencies and being able to predict behavior and really get better traction. And again, leads to those business results. Next slide, please. And this is where we're going to introduce our panelists today. And again, we're very fortunate to have a great group with us today. We've done a lot of prep going into this, and we've all had some discussion back and forth. And I think we're going to have a really lively discussion here today. And again, I'll encourage you all in the audience, please feel free to jump in with your questions or comments as we get into the actual content. So let me introduce our panelists first. So first we have Arnie Richardson, who's the Managing Director for Strategic Solutions, Analytics, and Innovation at Duke Energy. He has over 12 years of utility experience specializing in big data and analytics. In his 9 years with Duke, he has worked in several areas, including distribution planning, load forecasting, load research, products and services, rate design, marketing and customer experience, and large account management. That seems like that's almost the entire utility enterprise, Arnie. He is currently leading a team that is helping transform the customer experience through the use of advanced analytics and AI. Arnie has a bachelor's degree in business administration, finance, and mathematics from Ohio University. And with that impressive background, Arnie, can you tell us a little something about yourself that maybe doesn't show up in a bio? Tell us something about yourself.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Excited to be here today. I am at Duke Energy, like you said, in Charlotte, North Carolina. Today, I am coming to you from Ohio, where I grew up at my parents' house. It's unexpected, but I'm here and the house is full of dogs and toddlers and people, so hopefully there's no distractions. If you were wondering where the name Arnie came from, you can probably see all of these golf pictures behind me that my dad has hanging up. I am named after Arnold Palmer. So in my free time, I try to live up to the hype of my name, not very successfully though. Also have a almost 2-year-old, like to try to spend my time traveling, seeing family and friends, and some of that stuff as well. So a little bit more about me.
Very good. Thanks, Arnie. And I was kind of wondering about the name. So that's awesome. Very good. Next, we have Matt Morrow, who leads the digital transformation team at CGI's U.S. and commercial and state government operations. He focuses on energy transition-related solutions for the energy and utilities industries, including CGI's Open Grid 360 initiative. A highly experienced consultant, solution architect, and delivery lead, Matt has extensive expertise across all aspects of software development and systems integration. He has also supported large migration programs in the utilities and telecom sectors. I'm sure he has some more stories from that. He has more than 25 years of experience in the IT industry, delivering innovative solutions for utilities across industries and geographies. So Matt, thank you for joining us, and tell us a little something about yourself. Oh, we're not hearing you.
I'm on the phone. Thank you.
There we go.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, my name is Matt Morrow. I'm originally from the UK. I currently live in Fort Collins, Colorado. I travel all around the world working for CGI. Don't have any children, but we are responsible for 1 cat, 4 chickens, and about 50,000 bees. So fairly busy even without the kids. So great to be here. Thank you.
Nice. Good stuff. I'd be interested. I'm assuming then you're in the honey production business.
Yes.
Good. All right. I would love to try some sometime. That's one of my things. All right. And kind of rounding out the panel today, we have Tim Fairchild. Many of you may know Tim from his many years at SAS, but Tim's now an independent consultant, and he's leveraging his extensive experience working at the intersection of data analytics, global supply chain, manufacturing, and energy to provide insights into the rapidly evolving intelligent energy infrastructure market. Tim spent over 20 years at SAS, the global analytics leader, and he held a variety of leadership, business development, and product management positions, including as the director of the SAS global energy practice. Before joining SAS, he was a supply chain professional at IBM and Compaq. Tim is a graduate of the Haslam College of Business at the University of Tennessee and is a proud member of the 2012 class at the University of Idaho's Energy Executive course. He now has the privilege of serving on multiple external advisory positions at North Carolina State University, UNC Chapel, and UNC Charlotte. So Tim, tell us a little something about yourself that you have going on there in North Carolina.
Mike, thanks a lot. And by the way, bees and golf are 2 of my favorite things. So I'm just delighted to be in this group. So long before I was an energy guy, I was a supply chain guy. And I've learned a lot about energy from reading and from listening. I know supply chain from doing. And I had the opportunity to work in some of the most complex global supply chains on the planet. And I'm probably the only one here on this in this big group who is a licensed customs broker. So I took the exam. I got a 98 out of 100 on my first try, and I knew this book, CFR 19, I knew it backwards and forwards. And I'm delighted that I've got a foot in the two most important industries and sectors in this world, supply chain and energy.
All right, very good. Well, thank you to all three of our panelists. And I think what we want to do now is get into a little bit more of the discussion. And I'm going to ask if we could just move forward one slide, and we'll get started. As you may recall from those opening remarks, we have three areas, and the first one we're going to hit is looking at what we're calling from data to predictive analytics. And I think that most of us would agree that our industry, utilities, arguably within that industry, everyone is somewhere on that journey. They're managing data with governance and data management issues and data security and moving data around. But how far are they along in terms of actually applying that data for business value, which often ultimately lands, of course, in doing things predictively or even prescriptively. So we want to open this up to our panel, and I'm going to start with a question for Tim. Tim, with all of your experience at SAS, I think that I know from having worked with you in the past, you have probably dozens of different utilities that you've worked with, and you've seen them all on this journey. So where do you see they're having challenges as they're going from, hey, we've just got some data here, to actually being able to leverage that into use cases that have business value? And that business value may just be providing better information and insights. It may be doing things truly predictively or prescriptively. So, what is a challenge or two that you see them as they move forward with this, from just that pure data to actually business value?
Yeah, Mike, I think it's all about gathering use cases, having really good use cases, and then prioritizing them for value. Now, it doesn't seem like it was that long ago, but about 2013, I had a front row seat to something that Duke did. Duke invited so-called big data vendors to play in their sandbox. And this was a sandbox with data from different Duke systems. And they invited a large number of vendors to actually play in the sandbox and come back with use cases. And I keep a lot of things. I still have the 2014 final report. And as it turns out, they had 17 vendors that came back and responded. And it was interesting to me that they grouped them into three groups. One, vendors with industry experience. Number two, vendors with analytics experience, and number three, vendors with IT systems experience. And there's a really interesting comment here that says, not one vendor has all three areas completely covered. And I think that says a lot about vendors selling into the industry who might know their space, whether it's data or data access or analytics, but they don't know their industry. Now, these 17 vendors, they submitted a total of 157 use cases that cover the gamut, from load forecasting to assets to customer experience. And I know that 10 years later, Arnie, I know that Duke is still working on some of those 157 use cases, but I also know that Duke has added a lot to them since then.
So with that, Tim, and I'll open this up to the panel, as you identify use cases, that's part of that journey. I keep using the term journey, but I think it's appropriate here. And this, Matt, this can be from some of the clients you've worked with, and Arnie, of course, you're up to your eyeballs in this every day at your job. Is there any steps that, wow, this was hard, or we really had to figure this out? Is it data quality issues? Is it trying to do things in a real to near real time environment? Is it meeting expectations that people hear because they see some really cool commercials about AI on TV and they expect things to just happen. I mean, a little bit more maybe about what those challenges are and maybe how you've seen folks overcome these.
Yeah,
I will say, go ahead, Ollie, go ahead.
Okay, I'll let you go first next time. It's a great question. Here at Duke Energy, which, by the way, Tim, I wasn't around back then. I joined Duke at the end of 2015, but I'd love to see what ideas we had back then and where we're at now. So maybe you can share that with me. But we're a big company. We have a history of mergers, right? So a lot of different systems. So just in the past few years, we have gone from 5 billing systems to 1 billing system. So you can imagine the different data pipelines that we had when we had data in 5 different billing systems that recorded things slightly differently and interpreted things slightly differently and stuff like that. So it's been a huge effort to kind of consolidate that data over the past few years and then use it for analytics purposes. Another thing that jumped to the top of my mind, March, April 2020. People probably remember that time, right? That's when COVID hit. And I got a call from a partner of mine in forecasting. He was like, Arnie, like, we've got to figure out what's going on with our industrial load. Like, are we seeing people, stopping work? Like, it seems like our load's dropping. Like, we gotta figure this out. Like, can we use the AMI data to really look at this? And that was probably like the first time where we really utilized our interval data for true like analytics type work back in 2020. A lot of our large customers are not AMI meters. They're special meters that are made to handle that type of large load. I don't really understand the engineering behind it. And it actually comes through 2 different systems, MV90 and IEE, depending on our jurisdiction, because technology is different in all of our jurisdictions. And then you have all the AMI data as well. And so the purpose of this data at the time was for billing, right? And we never really touched, validated, did anything with the data that was not being used for billing purposes, right? And so all of a sudden we're needing to use this data for analytics, but the pipeline from these systems to our analytics system at the time was not great. We didn't have any validation up front on this data, so it opened the doors to a multi-year project to kind of consolidate all of this interval data, streamline it, and make it readily available for analytics with regular checks into the data. So, stories like that just kind of repeat themselves time over time because of all the different technology systems, stuff like that. And analytics has always been kind of a second use case, but it's becoming more and more important and prioritized more and more.
Yeah, and I would imagine as you described that, I was just thinking the scale of this probably adds to the complexity of it because there's just so much data and of course the variety of data as well. So that scale is probably an added dose of fun for you.
We have 8 million meters at Duke Energy. So about 15-minute readings for 8 million customers. If you do the math, we get 1 billion rows of usage data every 30 hours.
Wow. Yeah. That's scale.
That's
Matt, how about
data.
you? What have you seen with some of the folks you've been working with, Matt?
Well, I think what we're seeing is the silos within a utility, whether that's organizational silos or system silos, are needing to be broken down. Departments that didn't used to work together are now having to work together because things like DERMS are coming, renewables are being installed behind the meter, and so there's organizational change to deal with, and also sort of breaking down the system silos as well to get a more holistic view of the utility across those systems as well.
Yeah, and it's funny how sometimes all the technology in the world isn't going to quite get you there. It's that organizational stuff and making the processes work. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Yep.
I want to ask you another question here while we're still on this part of our discussion, and I want to get into the cloud a little bit. So, I've talked to dozens of utilities about what they're moving to the cloud. Is it just for storage and all the benefits there in terms of cost saving and burst, accessing data for burst computing and all that kind of stuff? And of course, some of the actual applications are happening in the cloud. So, Arnie, with what you all are doing there at Duke, kind of where are you all in terms of leveraging the cloud? Are there specific use cases? And oh, by the way, are there some that heck no, we're not going to put it in the cloud? I've heard a lot of the more operational things like SCADA and things, you want that on-prem, et cetera. But what are some of the things you all are seeing and doing in terms of the do or do not relative to the cloud?
Yeah, it's a good question. The cloud is new for us. I think Duke's a large company, a lot of analytics teams, a lot of people getting on the cloud. But my team went live on the cloud last summer, so we're a little over a year on the cloud, and I would say most of the company is working towards that. I have not heard of any use cases that we cannot put on the cloud. I know that like myself on the customer side is pushing to consolidate everything on the cloud. I work closely with like the distribution grid people in the organization. They're doing a lot of their stuff on the cloud too. So the SCADA data and stuff for the distribution grid is landing on the cloud as well. There's definitely some challenges, right? I mean, the security and that stuff is kind of what made us slow to adopt it. But as a company, we've kind of overcome that a little bit. But there's also things just like the model of how you pay these people. And someone told me the other day for the first time on my team, like, yeah, I can run that model. It's going to cost $200, right? And so like that kind of mindset of like, how much does it cost to run a model is new, and the people coding have to think differently. Skill sets, we had to upskill a lot of people, teach them a lot of these things, and that comes into when we're hiring and stuff like that. And then we still don't have all of our data on the cloud, right? I've already talked about all of our systems and differences in different jurisdictions. So we're still working on that. So it's definitely a journey for us. And there's some people that have jumped on and embraced it in the company. Some people that are, still good with their SQL Server environment, and some of their more lightweight computing tools that they're running with.
Yeah, I had a question for you, and for the panel maybe. You mentioned using SCADA data. I would imagine that's data in the historian that you're then using for different grid use cases, as opposed to the actual real-time SCADA stuff. Maybe that's outside of your purview.
It's a little bit outside of mine. I would say it's more of the historic data, not a lot of real-time usage today, but I know there's use cases out there that we're exploring.
Yeah, and we're going to actually get into that a little bit more in just a little bit, but that good stuff there.
Hey, Mike, I've got a question for Arnie, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it, Tim.
It cost $200 in the cloud to run that model. Do you know how much energy it consumed? Because I see these really interesting stories about how much energy it takes to, create an image of a dinosaur, on a surfboard. Have you been able to work that out yet? Of course, you make it, so it's not like you're buying it from somebody else, but.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I am in the organization, like my boss is over like economic development and large account management and stuff like that. When I think AI in the utility industry, I'm really thinking about like, how are we going to really serve all of these new data centers that are popping up everywhere, right? I mean, it's some of the biggest load growth we've seen in my lifetime, probably. So I don't know the answer for how many kilowatts or kilowatt hours it takes to run that model, but I do know these AI data centers, they're showing up and they're wanting a lot of energy from us.
Yeah, and then that's actually changing whole economies. I've been looking at some things that, for instance, Georgia Power is doing, and of course they have some new nukes down there that's almost part of their, that is part of their pitch to the CNI customer base is, if you want clean, reliable power, we've got it. because of that type of growth. So there's some interesting things, even demographically, because I think the Virginia area around DC was a hotbed for all these big data centers, but they're kind of tapped out. So now they're moving on to other parts of the country where they can get reliable power and the land isn't crazy expensive and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, it's changing the landscape. I do see we have a question in the chat, and it's actually very timely because our next topic we're going to ask about is AI, and this is an AI-related question. So I'm going to ask Matt a question about AI, and then we're going to get to the one in the chat that is very much related to this. So again, Matt, with your experience and your work at I would imagine dozens of utilities over the years, now we see AI popping up everywhere for good reason, and kind of an extension of the discussion we've been having about moving from data to predictive analytics and the AI fit in all of that. What do you see utilities needing to do to really be prepared to operate in this, I'll call it an AI environment? Surely there's things around the IT infrastructure, the business process, and getting to our question that's in the panel, I'm sorry, on the chat, the cybersecurity considerations and risks that come with AI. So maybe a little bit about what utilities should be thinking about as they move into more of an AI operating environment.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think in speaking with customers and potential customers, we're still seeing quite a wide range of perspectives on AI in the utility space. Everything from still concerns around, is it viable? What about hallucination in LLMs, etc.? And then at the other end of the spectrum, embracing it and implementing AI today. And I think we're moving more towards the latter. Most utilities are getting to implementing some forms of AI. I think we just talked about compute costs. I think compute costs are going to be something that has to be really thought through for a utility. I only mentioned the vast amount of data that you can generate with these all these devices, and so I think basically aligning AI use cases with a strategic vision for what are the objectives. How does it align technologically with the utility? I think we're sort of more in the MVP space now. Proof of concepts don't seem to be reaching productive value. So really understanding an MVP, how does it align with your objectives? How does it align with your technology? And then sort of making sure you can implement that MVP into production and then iterate value on top of it is kind of where we're seeing utilities get some value from AI. I think there's some interesting use cases we've already spoken to utilities about. One thing from the first day I worked with a utility, I heard about a concern around aging workforce. And unfortunately, I'm now one of the aging workforce myself. But the concern was all about the institutional knowledge that walks out the door when somebody retires. And I was just reading about utilities looking to use Gen AI to actually mitigate that risk, to actually run an LLM on top of the vast amount of data they have already, and basically be able to bring in new talent and bring them up to speed more quickly as a way of mitigating that classic aging workforce problem.
And what about cyber considerations? Have you run into that much? And I'm asking Matt, but Tim and Arnie, if you all have run into that as well, please chime in too. But Matt, what are you seeing in that space in terms of concerns and risks?
I mean, obviously there's a concern if you're doing things on public infrastructure, but a lot of the companies that we're talking to, we're doing it all in-house within the four walls of the utility, virtual four walls of the utility. So cybersecurity sort of handled that direction by just keeping everything fairly private. To be honest, I'm not a cybersecurity expert. I'll probably defer to Arnie for his experience in that area as well.
Yeah, because you all are definitely moving in that direction, Arnie.
Yeah, and I'm not the cyber expert either. I am on the business side, not the IT side. So it's a good thing if I don't have to talk to the cyber people too much. That means I'm doing all the right things. But I think Matt's right. I mean, it's just a matter of making sure we have the right infrastructure in place, make sure that we're doing it in a private, secure location and not doing something super publicly. But I will say we have a whole AI team that is kind of working on this type of stuff for standards across the industry or across the company to make sure that anyone that's kind of in the AI analytics data space is playing along to company best practices.
Okay. And Tim.
I'm clearly not a cyber expert, but I know a guy. And I really, really recommend that you find Charles Durant, Durant, on LinkedIn. He's with Oak Ridge National Labs. And I get to see and hear him speak almost every year in Idaho. And if I had hair, it would curl it. He shares about 0.5% of what he knows, because that's all that he can really share publicly. But if you really want to get up to speed and informed on a realistic view of cyber threats for the energy industry, Charles Durant is your guy.
All right, great reference. Thanks, Tim. That was a great way to open things up. We're going to move on to customer use cases now, and we have some things we want to cover there. Next slide, please. And I'm going to start with a question for the entire panel. And what I really want to get into here is some of the things that the richer data, primarily via smart meters, of course, but also some of the information in a CIS or a CRM. What are some of those things that are improving that utility to customer engagement and experience? And you know, you can start with accurate and timely bills, right? And then there's maybe time of use rate structures. Maybe there's remote connect, disconnect. I think those are pretty well established. I also think there's some things that are happening that are well beyond those. Not that those don't create a lot of value themselves, but what are some of those things where utilities are leveraging all that data to do some things that are really benefiting the customers? And I've seen some pretty interesting examples of this. So I'm going to just open it up to the board, and whoever wants to jump in first, please do.
Hey, it's a jump ball. I'll take it, Mike. I'll take it. So I believe that in the short term, and of course in this industry, short term means 10 years. It's just an incredible industry when that's considered short term. But the real game changer, it's not a technology, it's not software, it's not a piece of hardware. It's a carbon-based life form that's carbon emitting. It's us, it's people. It's getting people to change their behavior, particularly on those 100, 200 hours a year when demand is at its peak. And if all we did was cut down on consumption during those peak times, it would be transformative to the grid, to capital budgets, to air quality. And I'm going to give a little tip of the hat to Duke. I've been a Duke customer for a long time, and Duke's been really, really good about supplying me with electricity. I've been really, really good about paying my bills. And they did something that absolutely delighted me. I think it was earlier this year. They started sending me an email about halfway through the billing cycle, projecting my cost for that month. So I've always been a comfort lover. I'm in that segment. And I'm still a comfort lover, but I'm going to be at some point changing over to a fixed income, conserve at all costs. And I love that last month, right in the middle of my highest ever bill I've ever had in my whole life, Duke sent me an email, and it said they predicted $180 was my usage, and they predicted $301. Now, Duke missed it by 10%, but that's fine. But if I was already behaving as a fixed income segment, I guarantee when I got that email, Arnie, I would have cranked up the thermostat to 78. I would have shut off every light in my house. So I just kudos to Duke for leveraging data that you've had for a long time, putting that together with load forecasting, and dealing with me as an individual customer segment of one.
Yeah, and Tim, it's interesting they sent you an email for that. I'm wondering if our panel has either come across or is working in a realm where you have an actual mobile app that can send alerts and other types of information? Is because I've seen this happening in other utilities. What are y'all's experience with that?
I'll say I did not pay Tim to say this for not giving him any bill credits or discounts for all the nice things he's saying. Um, Tim is right though. We're trying to give more and more insights into our customers' usage and give them the tools that they need. And it just starts with information, right? So the usage alerts. We also have our home energy report, which most of you are probably familiar with. Insights into your disaggregated usage, comparing it to similar customers, giving you some tips and recommendations on how to use energy and save energy and stuff like that. We do have a mobile app. We're trying to get more of this integrated into the mobile app. I think just in the past couple months, we've started doing push notifications for some of our like bill pay reminders and stuff like that. So we're starting to dabble in some additional channels and mobile friendly ways to communicate, right? Emails, text messages, now push notifications, all ways to kind of continue to engage with our customers in different ways.
Yeah, and I think as
And
the demographics change as well, this is going to be the expectation, right?
Yep.
I'm old. I'm 60. Our daughters are 28 and 25, and they live on those darn things, which is a whole nother story. But yeah, the demographic changes matter too. I'm sorry, Matt, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think it is imperative for utilities to get closer to their customers, because as the customers install more and more capable and complex devices behind the meter, the utilities are going to want to be able to leverage those resources and work with the customers with those resources. And so whatever they can do to get closer and get more interaction with the customer, I think is a great idea. The Duke example is a great one.
Yeah.
Although that really depends on customers who want a close interaction with their energy provider, and it may shock you to know this. I don't want that with Duke Energy. I've got the app, and I'm not a guy that goes on the app every day and looks at my usage and all that stuff. I'm a very simple customer. I just expect electricity, and then Duke expects me to send them some money. But it's really about understanding, and I've got some data maybe we can get to later on about this disconnect and this view that all customers want their energy provider, they want them to be a trusted advisor, and they want to communicate with them on a regular basis. The data shows a lot of customers just want to be left alone.
Yeah.
They want you to be there when they need them, but they really don't desire. Now, that probably doesn't work with the folks on this call being in the energy business. But if you look at the folks that are not on this call, how interested are they in interacting with their energy provider every day?
I agree, Tim. In fact, I've preached that on that soapbox myself a few times, but I think there's a few caveats to that. As electric vehicles and rooftop solar and everyone having a battery in their garage, as that becomes more of a real thing, by definition, the customer is interacting more with their utility. And I think that's going to change the level of interest. I think the other thing is that there is an expectation now, going back to the demographic thing, where literally everything else I do is on my phone. I should just be able to hit an app and get my utility information when I want and need it. I don't need to see it all the time. But I think it being there is an expectation. And then just the third thing I would mention on this is, I think as prices go up, customer engagement with their utility will increase, because they're used to paying whatever it is. I've averaged $120 on my bill for the last 5 years. Now all of a sudden it's 160 or 170 or 180, and this is happening a lot out west. So I think as price becomes more sensitive, there's going to be a lot more interaction. So I agree with you, but I think there's some caveats on the horizon that are changing that. Before we go ahead, we do have a couple of more questions, and I think one is for Arnie and one is for the panel. So Arnie, an organizational question for you. Is your AI team part of the business? Are you in IT, or are you in both, or maybe something altogether different? Where do you sit organizationally, and how's that working?
Yeah, great question. I'll kind of give you the Duke landscape. We do have a centralized enterprise analytics team within the larger IT digital transformation space. That's really where enterprise analytics sits, and anyone at the company can come and make requests and partner with that team. I am personally, though, a couple layers down, but in the customer organization, reporting eventually up to the chief customer officer, and as kind of a focused analytics team within customer, working on all things customer analytics, right? We do have strong partnerships with IT, though, right? They have people that work on our projects with us and engage with us. We're just really kind of the ones that are business facing, talking to the different people in the business, understanding priorities, and bringing that back, working with IT to actually deliver some of those solutions.
And can I ask, why is that? If the norm is to have the more centralized analytics capabilities, but you all are within one of the business units, was that just because someone in the leadership ranks identified that as a need, or saying, hey, let's try decentralizing some of this and let's see how it goes in the customer realm?
It's probably a little bit of leadership preference, but it's also just because of the amount of opportunity for analytics in the customer space, right? It's so, there's so much there that having a dedicated team to really own that and bring that innovation mindset, be part of the business solution, made a lot of sense. There's a few other organizations that have that. Like I know supply chain has their own analytics team and stuff like that. So it's kind of hit or miss throughout the organization. But when you start to see very specific big use cases, that's when we see some of these other teams pop up outside of kind of the centralized enterprise analytics.
That makes sense. I'm going to open up this next question, which is from our audience, to the panel, and I'll read it out and we'll see where we go from there. So are you all coming across any use cases around generative AI in the customer space? And if so, or if yes, would you share a few examples and what some of the benefits are there? So of course, generative AI is grabbing a lot of attention and mind share these days. What are you all seeing specific to the customer side of the business? Tim, it looks like you're ready to jump in, I can tell.
No, I'm just smiling because I'm actually moderating a panel next week with John Presley from Duke and Johnny Whitfield from OGE, and I'm going to ask them that question. That's why I'm smiling. I'm going to cut and paste that, and I'm going to ask them next week because that's a great question.
Okay. All right. What about you all, either Matt, in the many utilities that you work with, or Arnie, in your experience, where are you seeing generative AI either starting to develop or maybe where it's already being applied?
I'll defer to Arnie on this one. I work more on the T&D side of the utility. Arnie's not on the customer side, so I think he's better qualified on this one.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'll admit that I personally am not doing much in this space. And keep in mind, there's multiple analytics teams at Duke. So I know that there is a team that is looking at generative AI in that enterprise analytics space and trying to collect use cases and apply it and figure out how to use that. And that wide range of different use cases, not all customer space. I can tell you, though, that we are starting to look at our call center, contact center technology, and we want to make some upgrades there. And so that's where I see us kind of first starting to get into the generative AI capabilities with customer facing type of applications. So yeah, we're not very deep into that yet, but in the next few years, I see us kind of really exploring that, making some progress there.
Okay. All right, and Arnie, while we're with you, I wanted to ask you another question while we're in the customer realm. What are some business results that you're seeing around this idea of improving the customer experience and that level of customer engagement as you leverage more of this data-rich environment? So what are some business results you can point to and say, wow, boy, we've improved that by X%, or we didn't have that capability before, or our CSAT scores are telling us this? What does that look like at Duke?
Oh man, good question. I can go a lot of different ways with this, but Tim, what you were talking about like partnership with customers and how they might not actually want to partner with us, keep it easy for them. It kind of comes top of mind. You know, in North Carolina, we have filed our carbon plan, right? It's our biggest jurisdiction, and we have very specific carbon goals. And our IRP process has filed kind of a carbon plan IRP that explains how we are going to achieve our carbon goals. Part of the way we are going to do that is to do something that we like to call shrink the challenge. And what that means is using things like energy efficiency, demand response, managed EV charging, TOU rates, you name it, to shift demand away from those peak hours so that you don't even have to build new generation, right? The load's not even there, so we're shrinking the challenge because now we don't have to build as much generation. And so that shrink the challenge concept, it's tied to another thing we say all the time, the grid edge evolution, right? And how do you really start to change the way we think about these devices behind the meter at the grid edge and how they play a role in this carbon transition? Well, if you want your customers to start engaging with you and participate in your demand response, participate in your energy efficiency programs, get on some of these new dynamic rates and stuff, you've got to get the basics down super, super well, right? The fact that we're sending a usage alert to Tim and telling him like, hey, here's what we think your bill is going to be during a hot summer where we know rates have gone up recently and bills are going to be high, that builds some good relationships with Tim, right? He appreciates that email. He loves the insights. And while that alone might not get us much, our CSAT starts to go up, our NPS starts to go up there, right? And now that Tim enjoys working with us, he likes, you know, some of the solutions we're giving him to help him manage his bill, he might be more likely to click on an email that says, hey, check out our new managed charging rate. Or, hey, check out our DR program, right? We'll give you a free thermostat if you let us control your thermostat for 10 days out of the year and stuff like that. So I truly believe that while it's going to be hard and we're not going to have that deep level of interaction and partnership with all of our customers, it is going to be important to our grid edge and to our carbon plan achievements in the future. And you got to get the basics down. You got to give a strong basic customer experience when it comes to paying your bill, outages, reliability, all that kind of stuff. That's the baseline. Then you start to get people engaged in a way that really helps shape the load and brings value to the utility.
Yeah, Arnie, it's so interesting that you mentioned bills, and I haven't been able to find it. I just started looking for it this morning when it popped into my head. But I've seen a paper correlating CSAT scores with how past due your bill is, and to the extent that you find reasons not to like your provider when you owe them a lot of money. And it was just a fascinating, you know, test of psychology and behavior of how CSAT scores can be influenced by unpaid bills. And that debt that has to still be enormous post, I mean, I know it was large during COVID, and I've got to imagine that in our current economic environment, that number's not smaller today. So I think more and more people are living in energy poverty and just don't have the money to pay their bills.
Absolutely. And, you know, we dug into our customers that are in arrears a lot. A couple years ago, North Carolina Low Income Collaborative published the results, right? And there's a correlation to the efficiency of a home and how much in arrears you are as well, right? So these customers that can't pay their bill, they're the same customers that need the energy efficiency solutions that could benefit from a bill credit from a demand response program and stuff like that, right? So how do you start responding to people that don't pay bills or can't pay their bills with real tools in the toolbox to help them in the future get out of that situation in the first place? right? And so that's the type of relationship you really have to build using data and analytics to find those opportunities to get customers to engage with us like we're hoping they will.
Oh, and I just love
It's
that
not easy.
topic. It's not always easy for the folks. Low-income people don't always own their house. And then
Right.
that means that you're dealing with landlords, you're dealing with multi-unit housing. And I think it's one of the things that the industry has to get really, really good at, helping low-income people who don't have all the things that most of us have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Big focus at Duke.
Well, good. I have actually, well, there's another question from the audience, and well, I'm going to open this up to the panel as well. How are customer business units involved in training LLMs or large language models? So anybody have any experience with this? Arnie, it's probably, given your role, this may be primarily directed at you, but I would love to hear from the panel on this in terms of how the business units are involved in doing some of that model training.
Yeah, again, I don't have a lot of direct experience. I know there's people at the company that are doing this, but we're not involved in use cases that require this type of modeling.
Okay. Okay. Anybody else have any experience with that? Maybe not.
I mean, a lot of what we've done with the LLMs has been around using in-house documentation that already exists to actually train the models. So not direct involvement from a particular department as much as gathering existing information and using that to train an in-house model.
Okay. All right. That may be one we want to explore a little further down the line. I'm going to ask kind of a little bit of a crystal ball question, and I'm going to ask Matt, but our other panelists, please chime in as well. If we look ahead a few years, maybe 2028 or 2030, what are some examples of what a utility can do to improve that customer experience in a way that also aligns with the utility's business goals? And that, of course, there's reliability metrics, there's client sat scores or customer sat scores, there's renewable energy goals. There's a lot of those things. So what are some things utilities can be doing, again, leveraging data and analytics and that customer experience to help meet those goals? What are y'all seeing in that space? And Matt, I'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the key things we're going to see over the next few years is really broader implementations of DERMS solutions. So I think we've seen quite a few utilities do pilots and various other initiatives around targeted use cases. And we're starting to see now more broader enterprise DERMS programs being put into rate cases, being put out to bid. And I really think that's sort of a sort of combo solution that's going to help customers leverage their existing investment in their behind the meter resources to get better value out of those resources. It's going to help the utility in terms of meeting decarbonization goals and potentially improving reliability, easing congestion, etc. And so there's sort of multiple ways that DERMS are going to come to bear on customer satisfaction, decarbonization, reliability, and so on. And still a maturing space. There's still a lot of unknowns out there, but I do think we're at the tipping point now where DERMS is increasingly going to be a solution to meet a lot of those goals. I think sort of a slightly out of left field example here I came across was SDG&E in Southern California have implemented a number of microgrids, which obviously delivers to a lot of their various goals, customer satisfaction around increased reliability. It helps them when they have wildfire mitigation issues. But also, one of the things they did with their microgrids is they actually targeted an air attack base that's actually used for resources that can be used to fight wildfires. So not only did they improve their reliability, they sort of added to the community, and I have to think that would help with their customer satisfaction scores, that they are enabling wildfires to be mitigated through use of technology like microgrids. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, SDG&E is doing a lot of interesting things. They're out there on the leading edge on a lot of this stuff. I want to go back to the DERMS that you talked about. What are your thoughts? And again, this is for you, Matt, but also for the panel, on the customer piece of that in terms of the customer expectation vis-a-vis DERMS, how you communicate with the customers and make sure they're properly engaged in these DERMS scenarios. What are y'all's thoughts on that?
For me, my crystal ball isn't that great. I think there's a lot of work to be done there. I think technology-wise, the solutions are available. I think how you engage with the customer, how you structure the programs to make them compelling but easily understood. I think there's a lot more work required there, because a lot of customers are just used to net metering or whatever mechanism is in place, and more is needed there to really be able to use those resources effectively.
Right. I think it's going to be a lot more interactive, and of course, it's going to be doing that at a much larger scale. So, I think, like you said, that the technology's there, but that customer expectation and communication piece, I think we're going to learn some lessons along the way on that one.
For sure. Yep.
I think what we're going to do, and I'm keeping an eye on the clock. I want to make sure we get to a few of the hot items here on the operational use cases area. We're going to transition to now. If we could advance the slide, please. So I'm going to start here in an area that is relative to one of the things we were just talking about. So I think we can all agree that DER penetration is growing. We're seeing a continuing increase of electric vehicles. That may be the rate of acceleration may be slowing there, arguably, if you follow that space. Rooftop solar, me living here in Northern California, is ubiquitous, and it's only going to grow. Now we're starting to see more homes with battery storage, so they're much more autonomous. So as these things all continue to grow, where do data and analytics impact how utilities are managing these DERs? And that's a loaded question, because it gets into DERMS, it could get into forecasting, but clearly that landscape with the customer and the distribution level primarily, we're going to see some changes there. And boy, that the data piece of this is just so foundational in being able to manage these things, often, by the way, in real to near real time. What are some examples or some things that you all are seeing or observing where data and analytics are helping facilitate or impacting this heavier DER world that we're moving into?
For me, I think what we're going to see is increasing amounts of AI again. I think the optimization problem for DERMS, forecasting for DERMS. I think there's massive utility in leveraging the data that we're generating from all these behind-the-meter devices and all the devices that have been installed on the grid in recent years, and bringing all that together to really help with the optimization problems that DERMS are going to have to deal with.
Good example. I agree. What else are you all seeing as DER penetration grows? Are there any things that leap out at you? And again, this can be operationally, or maybe there's some customer dynamics to that as well. We're all good there?
One thing we're trying to do, customers don't have to tell us when they have EVs, right? So like a big effort for us right now is trying to get really good at using that AMI data to detect where electric vehicles are on the grid. When we do find them, we're starting to partner to figure out, like, do we need to upgrade the transformer? Do we need to upgrade the wires going to these homes? And really start to get serious about those localized pockets of EVs and how that's impacting the distribution grid. So that's kind of like a problem.
And I'll add something, Mike. I mean, I think that a reason why we have broken the grid, and that's quite an accomplishment to break the grid, are DERs. And I think the elephant in the room that people are starting to say the quiet part out loud, not people like me, but leaders, C-level executives, we have broken the grid. Now, I'm blessed to live in a part of the country where I never worry when it's really cold, when it's really hot. Is the sun shining? Is the wind blowing? Are the batteries charged? I don't have to worry about that. But that's not the case for people who live in California, Texas, parts of MISO, PJM, New England, Alberta, Matt's home country. It is a mess. But I think that's a great opportunity for people who love to solve problems, for engineers, because this isn't about feelings and emotion and ideology or politics. It's about two things. It's physics and economics. And those are both, that's science and the dismal science, of course, but it's all based on math. And I think it's an opportunity for the best and the brightest students to come into an industry and help solve problems that are really going to make a difference in the world.
Yeah, and it's a big problem. It's what's the quote I've heard? It's the grid is the world's biggest machine, if you think about it in that context, and everything that goes with that. So there's a lot of interesting challenges therein. We do have another question from our audience, and I do want to open this up to the panel. This one's a little different, but it's pretty interesting, and this does get, I think, to the customer side of things, although there's certainly operational and grid impacts as well. So the question is, with beyond the meter devices, how could the energy industry influence device manufacturers so that there is more easy integration with utilities to include sharing telemetry data? So what are some things you all are seeing? It could be experiences you've had as either a customer, an integrator at the utility, where these beyond the meter devices are being deployed, and how the utility industry can maybe make that whole part of the infrastructure a little more integrated with everything else that's going on, particularly the data component with that. What do y'all see in there?
You know, I've seen elsewhere in the world, they solved that problem by simply saying, if you want to interconnect with my grid, you have to meet the standard, and that standard includes getting the telemetry data, being able to, you know, deal with dynamic operating envelopes or whatever it is that you think you need. And so Australia, a lot of Australia's gone that direction. They have their own standard. If you want to connect to the grid, you have to support that standard. Here in the US, that was probably quite a difficult problem to solve. So I don't really know what else we could do other than that kind of approach, where we just demand a certain interconnection standard.
Okay, that's a big part of it. I think that the sharing of the data, though, that could that could get a little tricky. I know that my experience probably isn't that different from our panel or folks on our session with us today. You know, I have friends who do not work in the industry, and when the whole smart meter thing was going on, some of them were completely paranoid about Big Brother. It's like, they're going to be taking data from me every 15 minutes. I don't know what they're going to do. Calm down. It's just your utility, you know. But I think the data sharing thing is a bigger deal when you get beyond the meter, when you start talking about, you know, obviously disaggregation of load and using the analytics that enables that kind of freaks some people out. Utilities being involved in smart appliances and when you can or cannot run your washer or dishwasher, those sorts of things. I think there is certainly some pushback from that. It's maybe a classic case of just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean that you should. But I think there's some interesting dynamics there around how we're going to move forward with that, because for a truly, I'll say, optimized grid, yeah, you'd have access to all that information. You'd be shifting load, you'd be managing load, but there's this thing called, you know, customers and their freedom and their choice. And I think somewhere there's going to be a meeting of loggerheads perhaps on that. What do you all think of that?
I think there are options, I should say, for utilities to work behind the scenes on that kind of information that they're looking for. So we worked with a customer where they were in a regulated market where the distribution utility doesn't actually have meter data. They're actually disconnected from the retail side. We were still able to take aggregated smart meter data and actually use machine learning. In this case, Mr. AI today it seems, but we use machine learning to actually predict where behind the meter devices had been installed, and we're pretty successful in using machine learning models to reliably predict where those devices had been installed, even without access to that detailed data. So there are options for utilities to solve the problem for things like planning, forecasting, if they just want to know where they're installed without necessarily crossing the line. And you know, so there are options, I think.
Okay. Good.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah,
Mike,
Tim, jump in.
Yeah, I was going to say, this seems like a great opportunity for the industry for for industry cooperating with academia and in labs and in places like NC State. NC State has a marvelous thing called the Freedom Center. UNC Charlotte has the Energy Production Infrastructure Center, EPIC. Duke is very involved in that. Clemson is very active. In fact, NC State, UNC Charlotte, and Clemson are part of something called CAPER. So it seems like academic institutions could be a convener of utilities and vendors to help accelerate this. Just an idea.
Yeah, Tim, that's a great example of that. And of course, you know, there's an election coming up, so you know that landscape will change. But of course, I think there's a role for the federal government there as well, especially when we're developing some of these new things. I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit here while we're still talking about some of the more operationally focused use cases. You know, if you reflect back a few decades, some of us are old enough to do that. You know, managing the grid was basically, you know, do you have your SCADA system? Is it working? Do you have it down to and including all your substations and all, you know, some basic questions like that. But that's certainly not the case anymore. What are some examples? And Tim, I'm going to start with you, but again, panel, please jump in and I'll help out where I can. What are some examples of where or how grid management has changed with the richer data and the ability to apply this data? This is just specifically with managing the grid. So I know there's some interesting use cases out there. Tim, have you seen any of these that you've come across in your work?
Well, I'm going to go back to the comment that the grid is in the process of basically coming apart. It's a slow motion wreck. And as we add more and more solar and wind, we need more spinning reserve. And to keep the grid stable, we need those big things that spin, as Bob Ballou from Dominion told an audience one time. And that means hydro turbines and steam turbines that are driven by heat from nuclear, gas, coal, molten salt, whatever. And again, I think this is a great opportunity for engineers to come to the rescue with data for new entrants into the workforce that are faced with a set of problems that the engineers that started in this industry, you know, 30, 40 years ago, never had to face. And I think it's again, another opportunity to employ physics, economics, and math to operate something that we are just so totally dependent on. And it's become much harder to operate than it ever has been.
Yeah, and I think part of that is, particularly when we start thinking about it from a data and analytics perspective, and this has come up several times on our session here today, is shifting load, managing load. You know, there's different ways of framing that. You know, smart EV charging programs, EE programs, DR programs, DERMS, all of these things are part of it. And again, you know, we're kind of talking about operational use cases and managing the grid more effectively and reliably. But boy, that customer interaction is just going to be so darn important as those renewable footprints grow. I mean, it's just going to be so important. And that's why I think there's a little bit of, I'll use the word angst, that may be too strong of a word, but angst across our industry in terms of how the heck are we going to get there and do that. I think pricing is going to be a big part of that. And the other thing, pricing / incentives, particularly with commercial and industrial loads. There's some great examples of what folks are doing in that space, of course, because that's where you have some really big swings with a smaller number of customers. So I think we're still learning our way through that. And then you throw that up against an electrification movement and an unprecedented growth movement, I think it gets interesting. I did moderate a webinar a couple of months ago, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. And I posed a question to our panel, one of whom was from a large investor-owned utility. I said, gosh, when you look at growth in EVs and electrification, AI and data centers, holy cow, you know, this is unprecedented. How are utilities ever going to manage the way through this? And he said, well, not to belittle it or to be too cavalier, but we kind of went through the same thing when air conditioning started to explode, you know, a couple of generations ago. So, we figured it out then, and we're figuring it out now. So I think there's some truth in that. But it certainly is a challenge in terms of managing the grid and keeping reliability where it needs to be.
And it's all data, Mike, and all that data is out there. And you've heard the stats about how much new data comes on board every day, and you think about all the data that is readily available today that wasn't there 5, 10, 15 years ago. All the data that you need to solve the problem is there. You just have to be able to access it, and you've got to have data literacy. You've got to have really good data science skills, but you've got to have people that understand the problem.
Mm-hmm.
People who know physics, who know how things work.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and that is part of the challenge. And actually, that's a good segue, Tim, because we're talking about the grid, but what about the assets on the grid? Utilities, as we alluded to earlier on today's session, have been kind of in sync with their asset management practices. In some cases, for the basic processes have been going on for decades. Of course, a lot of that's been automated. But the other thing that's happening now is this growth in data availability. I know I've seen some examples, for instance, where you can do transformer management programs where you're using that load data from smart meters. You're maybe even porting in weather data, and you're doing some modeling there. Of course, there's sensors on some of the actual assets where you're getting information around run times and temperatures and things of that nature. Matt, I'm going to ask you about this. Where are you seeing some real impacts around asset management because of this influx of data and the ability to do things, if not predictively, certainly more intelligently or more precisely, just because you have access to that data?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, obviously, historically, our asset management practices have been based on relatively small amounts of information. They were dumb devices, if you will, installed in the field, can't tell you very much about what's going on in the field, so you have to go out and visit them. So a couple of directions I think asset management is going to go. There's asset investment planning is something utilities have done for a long time, using complex mathematical models based on a relatively small amount of data. What are my best investment choices based on a desired set of outcomes? And I think that's, again, going to change dramatically when we can, Mr. AI again, I think we can deploy AI here with sensor data, with increasing amounts of operational data, and become much more sophisticated with our AIP. We won't have to maintain complex mathematical models, we'll just train AI models. And I think that will unlock a lot of value around asset investment planning. Similarly, from an inspection perspective, the majority of utilities I've worked with, particularly for the high volume distributed assets, their inspection regime is based on go and visit that asset every X number of months or every X number of years. The vast majority of those visits result in almost no action. It's clean bill of health, which is great for reliability, but at what cost to the customer, because you're sending these crews out over and over again. So, I'd like to see utilities and regulators embrace sort of more predictive inspection regimes and replacement regimes so that we can actually reduce the O&M cost through leveraging the data that we're now getting from these devices.
Yeah, there's definitely a shift away from time-based to more condition-based. But boy, there's a lot of nuances in that around workforce and technology and inventory and those sorts of things. So there's a lot of nuances, but they're definitely moving towards that. What are some examples that maybe you've seen? And again, Arnie and Tim, please jump in if you feel so moved. What are some examples? Like I gave that transformer example. That's something that I've actually seen modeled and deployed. What are some of the things? And transformers, a great place to start because there's so darn many of them, right? But what are some of the things that you're seeing, Matt, when you're out there working with your utility customers?
I'm sorry, Mike, you lost me there on the question. I didn't quite catch it. I apologize.
What are some of the asset classes, or maybe an example of where utility, I like to say sometimes there's a before, during, and after story. Before, this is how we manage this class of assets. But as we realize we're coming online with more data and we're starting to understand this data, this is how we're doing it now. And it may be, again, moving from time-based to condition-based. It may be trying to move towards things that are more predictive. What I've found in some of the asset management work I did just within the last year is across transmission, distribution, and substations, there's usually some pockets of that where they're a little more advanced, and that's usually because they have better data. Are you seeing anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much what I was saying before, really. I mean, I think we are moving away from that time-based regime because it's so inefficient and costly. And with that data, we can get a lot better about either inspections based on the data or even replacements based on the data where it makes sense. So, and obviously, the more intelligent the device, the more data we get and the better we can be around developing a better plan to manage those assets out in the field.
Yeah, and again, this begs a lot of questions around data quality. For instance, as the newer workforce comes in, they're used to working with a tablet or a device. You know, they're not going to be scribbling notes on a map book or what have you. You know, I was engaged on an advisory role about 8 months ago, and I'm sure some of you all will get a chuckle out of this. They've invested a lot on asset management systems, but there's still major chunks of their organization, again, across transmission, distribution, and substations. You can probably guess what I'm about to say: spreadsheets, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, the day Excel goes down is the day the grid goes down, right? So I think there is a movement away from that towards really leveraging some of these technologies that are available, but it's still out there. All right, I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and we are getting close to the end of our time together here. There is one question that I do want to ask, and I'll start with Arnie, but panel, please jump in. We've touched on some of this today. I'm having this question last because I think this is one that is truly going to be a make or break deal for utilities. To step back for a minute, if we just look at the way forecasting has been done over time, you know, the term I've heard used a lot is top down. You know, we have centralized generation. We can do this much power we can generate. We're estimating this much growth. You know, we run our algorithms. Boom, there's our 5, 10, 20-year forecast, if you will. Now all of a sudden that generation and those energy resources are distributed. They're everywhere. They're at the customer premise. And the term I've used to describe this is a need to transform from that top-down forecasting and planning approach to bottom-up, looking at a big service territory and realizing that some areas of your service territory are going to be richer in rooftop solar. Some communities are more wealthy, they're going to have more EVs, et cetera, et cetera. And living here in Northern California, where the three large investor-owned utilities here, on any given day, they may have infrastructure that is in a wealthy community, in a heavily migrant community. It can be on the ocean where there's weather conditions there that are foggy and chilly. And on that same day, it can be 105 here where I live, and they could have infrastructure buried in 8 feet of snow in the mountains. So you have all these different things happening at the distribution level, and the data has to be able to support this new forecasting model. So what are you all experiencing? And Arnie, I'm starting with you. How are some of the work that you're doing or your colleagues are doing are generating the data and maybe helping even create some of these predictive analytics where we can say, this is what it's going to look like in 10 years with a certain degree of certainty, and our infrastructure has to evolve to this, this, and this. So what is that looking like? And again, I think this is going to be ultimately a make or break deal for utilities because it is such a big shift in how they've traditionally managed things.
Yes, great question. Something I was heavily involved in probably started like 5 or 6 years ago, right? And the company wanted to create a circuit level 10-year hourly forecast for all of our circuits. So that project kicked off. That project is going well. Not super close to it anymore, but I believe it's live across all of our different jurisdictions. So we actually do have that circuit level forecast now. It is extremely, extremely difficult though.
Right.
When we created this forecast, we wanted to make sure that we understood, similar to what we did with the jurisdictional forecast, what's the base forecast with your general economic variables, your weather, your customer growth and stuff like that. But we wanted separate hourly load forecasts for EV adoption, for rooftop solar, even for our energy efficiency programs, right? So each one of those different forecasts that we've built for every circuit is its own analytics project, or solution on its own. Something like our energy efficiency forecast, you have to start to build propensity models. Who's
Right.
likely to adopt this, not today, but next year or the year after? Who's likely to adopt an electric vehicle, not today, but next year or the year after?
Right. Or next decade.
Same with rooftop solar. Yeah. You got to bring in economic variables. You got to understand the super localized micro level economics of different zip codes, different counties and stuff like that. So super challenging. And then when you get it all done and you add it all up, does it reconcile to your jurisdictional forecast, right? Because we still have the top down forecast. So how do you make sure that you're balancing that? We used to say that we started with smoothing the peanut butter. We took the peanut butter approach and just kind of used averages and spread it across all the circuits. And now we have kind of a chunky peanut butter approach where we're a little bit more accurate with exactly where we're going to see a little bit more, a little bit less of some of these things popping up. And it's funny because even where we're at and all the success we've had with getting down to the circuit level, we're still thinking about going to the meter level and exploring how do we get down to that level. And that's when you truly have a bottoms up, right? And then you think about it, and this is just for the planning aspect. So you need something similar for the more operational side, looking just, 2 hours ahead, 2 days ahead, next week, stuff like that, kind of that 7-day forecast. So it's super challenging, but like you said, super, super important.
Yeah.
Last thing I'll say is super cold mornings in North Carolina. A lot of customers have heat pumps and they have these heat strips that kick in when it gets to about 30 degrees, and demand just skyrockets with these, right? And so we used AMI data to try to determine who has a heat strip and where are we going to see that rise in demand, right? And so that's a real life example where maybe not the full solution, but we're using this AMI, this customer level data, to really understand load forecasting, short term, near term, long term, to make very important decisions about how we're operating the grid.
Yeah, it's a big change. And Tim or Matt, what are some of the things you're seeing in this realm of forecasting, and with the influx of DERs and the enabling data and analytics that are going to help us manage all this?
Matt, I'm going to let you go because I've got a fair amount to say about load forecasting. So I'm going to let you go.
I think you should go, Tim, because you both are more on the forecasting side than me. So why don't you give us what you got?
So I actually spent a lot of time at SAS learning about load forecasting, and what I learned was that it was largely a solved problem back in the 90s. It's not that it wasn't hard; it was very complex. But most companies got really, really good at that. And if you think about other industries, when they talk about forecast accuracy, they'll say 70 to 80% accuracy is world class, but not for utilities. They measure error, right? And so back then, a world class error rate was sub 1%, and it was achievable. And Arnie, I love that whole, I actually took notes on it when you described the complexity of load forecasting today. And it is it's become an unsolved problem. And that's not a bad thing, because that means bright people will rush in to solve it. And, as you said, and Mike, you said it's make or break. I mean, it's fundamental to everything the utility does from the next 5 minutes to 30 years. So my best advice is to get to know a guy named Tao Hong. Tao teaches at UNC Charlotte, and he probably has done more to advance the cause of load forecasting for this industry globally than anybody else on the planet. And I would encourage you to read 2 of his blog posts from 2013. The first one is titled 3 Must-Know Basics of Forecasting. And the second one is very cleverly titled 3 More Must-Know Basics of Forecasting. So there are 6 must-know basics, and I'm going to give them to you for free right now. And I used to have these in my head. Number 1, forecasting is a stochastic problem. Number 2, all forecasts are wrong. Number 3, but some forecasts are useful. Number 4, all forecasts can be improved. Number 5, really important, accuracy is never guaranteed. And then number 6, having a second opinion is preferred. So if you want to learn about forecasting, you could do a lot worse than to read the stuff from Tal, read what his students are doing, and you'll find his students all over the world practicing load forecasting, the type of load forecasting that we need in such a difficult environment.
Agreed. Yeah. Yeah. I remember doing some things with Tal. He's a smart guy. Sorry. Go ahead, Arnie.
I think I said the same thing you did, just agreeing Tal's great.
Yeah. Yeah. And he's right in your backyard, I think, over there in Charlotte. Good. Well, listen, I'm going to say thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to Energy Central for hosting this. And thank you to CGI for making this a reality. And I'm going to hand it back over to PJ, our host with Energy Central.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you, panel. Fantastic conversation today. For our audience, please look for an email containing a link with the replay in the next week or so, in case you missed it or you'd like to share with anyone else. And please take a moment also to complete our survey at the end of the section. Your feedback is greatly appreciated, and it will be used for future sessions. From everyone here at Energy Central, thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you on an upcoming power session. Thank you for attending. This does conclude today's presentation.